It all began when I purchased a stunning piece of land on the outskirts of a prestigious neighborhood, a place where I had planned to build my dream home. The property was private, spacious, and best of all, not under the control of any homeowners association. I had always heard horror stories about power-hungry HOA boards that imposed ridiculous rules and hefty fees, so avoiding that kind of hassle was a major factor in my decision. However, shortly after I started preparing the land for construction, I received an official-looking letter from a man named Richard Calloway, the HOA president of the neighboring community. The letter stated that my land had recently been annexed into their association and that I now owed several years' worth of back dues. I was completely shocked. I had reviewed all the paperwork when I purchased the property, and nowhere had it mentioned anything about HOA jurisdiction. Wanting to clear up what I assumed was a simple mistake, I attended one of their meetings, hoping for a reasonable discussion. Instead, I walked into a room full of smug faces, with Richard sitting at the head of the table as if he were the ruler of some private kingdom. He wasted no time telling me that my land was now subject to the HOA's rules and that I had no choice but to comply. He slid a thick rulebook across the table, filled with endless regulations about home design, landscaping, and even restrictions on how many vehicles I could park in my own driveway. When I argued that my property had never been part of their association, he simply smiled and said I had two choices: pay the dues and follow their rules, or sell my land and leave. I refused to be intimidated and told him I would be speaking to my lawyer about the matter. That was the moment everything changed. Within a week, I started receiving violation notices, each one more absurd than the last. One claimed that my land had too much exposed dirt from the excavation process, even though construction had barely begun. Another accused me of using unapproved building materials, despite the fact that my house had not even been built yet. They even fined me for the temporary mailbox I had installed, saying it was not in compliance with their standards. The harassment became relentless, and before long, they escalated their threats, warning me that if I did not pay up, they would place a lien on my property and eventually force me out through foreclosure. I knew this was more than just an overzealous HOA trying to enforce their rules. Richard had his own personal motives. I soon discovered that he had been trying to get his hands on my land for years, hoping to either acquire it for himself or sell it at a profit to one of his developer friends. Several neighbors confided in me that Richard had a history of using the same tactics to force people out. He had previously driven away a retired couple by drowning them in endless fines until they could no longer afford to stay. Now, he was trying to do the same thing to me. But what Richard did not realize was that I was not someone who backed down from a fight. I was not just going to defend my land, I was going to take control of the entire situation. If he wanted a battle, he was going to get one, and by the time I was done, he and his corrupt HOA board would regret ever coming after me. The moment I realized that Richard Calloway was not just enforcing HOA rules, but actively trying to steal my land, I knew I had to take action. I refused to be another victim of his underhanded tactics, and I was determined to find a way to not only keep my property, but to put an end to his corruption for good. My first step was hiring a real estate attorney, someone who specialized in HOA disputes and property rights. After reviewing my deed, my lawyer confirmed what I had already known. There was absolutely no mention of my land being under HOA jurisdiction when I had purchased it. The so-called annexation that Richard had cited was legally questionable at best. The HOA had never properly filed the required paperwork to include my land, meaning that their claim over my property had no legal standing. Armed with this information, I sent Richard and the HOA a formal notice disputing their authority over my land, demanding they cease their harassment immediately. But instead of backing down, they doubled their efforts. Within days, I received an official-looking foreclosure notice claiming that the HOA had placed a lien on my property for unpaid dues and violations. This was a blatant attempt to intimidate me, but they had underestimated just how far I was willing to go to fight them. I decided that if they were going to play dirty, I was going to hit them where it hurt the most, by exposing their corruption. I began digging into the HOA's financial records, speaking with other homeowners in the neighborhood, and collecting evidence of their illegal practices. What I uncovered was even worse than I had expected. Richard and the board members had been using HOA funds for personal expenses, skimming money from the association's budget, and imposing excessive fines on homeowners to cover their fraudulent spending. Several residents told me that Richard had pressured them into costly upgrades on their homes, only to later fine them for noncompliance with arbitrary rules. Others had tried to fight back, but they had been bullied into submission or forced to sell their homes. It was clear that Richard was running the HOA like his own personal empire, profiting off the backs of unsuspecting homeowners while silencing anyone who dared to challenge him. Armed with undeniable proof of their misconduct, I reached out to local news outlets and online forums dedicated to exposing corrupt HOAs. I sent them all the evidence I had gathered, detailing every shady deal, every fraudulent charge, and every instance of harassment. Within weeks, the story exploded. Reporters started showing up at HOA meetings, demanding answers from Richard and his board. Homeowners who had previously been too afraid to speak out finally started coming forward, sharing their own experiences of being bullied and exploited by the HOA. The pressure was mounting, and Richard knew he was losing control. But he still refused to back down, continuing to push forward with his attempts to take my land. That was when I decided to take my plan to the next level. If Richard wanted to play the long game, I was going to beat him at it. And my next move was going to change everything. After exposing the HOA's corruption to the public and putting Richard Calloway on the defensive, I knew I had the momentum to strike a final, crushing blow. The HOA was losing credibility, homeowners were turning against the board, and legal action was looming over them. But rather than simply waiting for the inevitable downfall of Richard and his cronies, I decided to take full control of the situation. That was when I came up with the most audacious plan yet. I was going to buy the entire HOA. It was a move that would not only secure my land once and for all but also ensure that no one else in the neighborhood would have to suffer under Richard's reign of terror. I started by researching the HOA's financial standing, and what I found was nothing short of a disaster. Due to Richard's mismanagement and misuse of funds, the HOA was in deep financial trouble. The association was drowning in debt from multiple lawsuits, unpaid maintenance costs, and a dwindling reserve fund. Their main source of income, the monthly dues paid by homeowners, was barely keeping them afloat, and now that residents were refusing to pay or demanding refunds, the HOA was on the verge of collapse. This was the perfect opportunity to strike. I reached out to several homeowners and proposed an idea. If I could acquire a majority of the properties in the neighborhood, I could effectively take over the HOA, vote out the corrupt board, and dissolve the organization entirely. At first, some people were hesitant. Many had lived under the HOA's oppressive rules for so long that they had accepted it as an unavoidable part of their lives. But once I explained my plan in detail, showing them how they could be free from ridiculous fines, arbitrary rules, and corrupt leadership, they began to see the vision. With the help of an investor friend, I started making offers on properties that were up for sale. Many homeowners, already fed up with the HOA and eager to escape the nightmare Richard had created, were more than happy to sell. I strategically purchased properties in key areas, ensuring that I would have enough voting power to influence major decisions within the HOA. Once I had secured a significant number of properties, I called for an emergency HOA meeting. Richard and his remaining supporters were clearly nervous, but they still believed they had control. That illusion shattered the moment I walked into the meeting and announced that I now held the majority vote. The room fell into stunned silence as I laid out my demands. Richard and his entire board were to resign immediately, all outstanding fines and liens imposed under their rule were to be nullified, and the HOA was to be dismantled completely. Richard tried to fight back, arguing that I could not just take over the association. But when I presented the legal documents proving my ownership of the majority vote, he realized he had no choice. The other board members, sensing the inevitable, resigned one by one. With no leadership left and no financial stability to keep the HOA functioning, the association crumbled. The once feared organization that had tormented homeowners for years was now nothing more than a failed scam. And just like that, I had not only secured my land, but I had also freed the entire neighborhood from Richard's tyranny. But my victory was not complete just yet. Richard had spent years abusing his power, and I had no intention of letting him walk away without facing the consequences. That was where my final move came into play, and it would be the one that ensured he never did this to anyone again. With the HOA officially dismantled and Richard Calloway stripped of his power, I could have stopped there, satisfied with my victory. But after everything he had done, not just to me, but to countless homeowners in the neighborhood, I knew that simply removing him from power was not enough. Richard had spent years abusing his authority, manipulating people, and stealing from the very community he was supposed to serve. I wanted to make sure that he faced real consequences for his actions and that he never had the opportunity to do this to anyone else again. The first step in my final move was gathering every piece of evidence I had against him. I had already exposed much of his corruption through the media, but now it was time to take legal action. With the help of my attorney, I compiled records of misappropriated HOA funds, fraudulent fines, and the illegal liens he had placed on homeowners' properties. Several residents, now free from Richard's control, eagerly provided testimony about how he had harassed them into submission. Some had been forced to pay thousands of dollars in bogus fees, while others had even lost their homes due to his manipulative tactics. The deeper we dug, the more criminal activity we uncovered. It turned out that Richard had been skimming money from the HOA for years, using the funds to finance his lavish lifestyle, vacations, expensive cars, and even renovations to his own home. He had created fake invoices for maintenance work that had never been done, funneling HOA money into personal accounts under the names of shell companies. What he had done was not just unethical, it was illegal. Armed with this evidence, we filed a lawsuit against Richard, seeking restitution for every homeowner he had wronged. But I did not stop there. I also reported him to local law enforcement, and with the overwhelming amount of evidence, they launched a full-scale investigation into his financial crimes. As the case built momentum, former board members who had once been loyal to Richard turned on him to save themselves, revealing even more details about his fraudulent activities. When the authorities finally arrested him, the entire neighborhood celebrated. Richard, the man who had once ruled over the community with an iron fist, was now facing charges of fraud, embezzlement, and financial misconduct. The state seized his assets, including his home, cars, and personal bank accounts, to repay the people he had stolen from. Many of the homeowners who had been wronged finally received compensation for the unlawful fines and fees they had paid over the years. Seeing Richard in handcuffs was the final confirmation that justice had been served. The man who had tried to take my land, ruin my life, and bully an entire neighborhood into submission was now powerless. But beyond personal vindication, this victory sent a powerful message: no corrupt HOA president or board member was above the law. This battle had started as a fight for my own property, but in the end, it became something much bigger. It became a fight for justice, for fairness, and for the right of every homeowner to live free from harassment and corruption. And as I watched Richard being led away, I knew that I had not only won the war, I had changed the lives of everyone in the neighborhood for the better. But there was still one more thing I needed to do, something that would ensure no HOA would ever rise again to take Richard's place. My final move was going to make sure that this neighborhood would never be controlled by greed and power ever again. With Richard Calloway behind bars and the corrupt HOA dismantled, the neighborhood finally had a chance to breathe. For the first time in years, homeowners no longer had to worry about ridiculous fines, arbitrary rules, or threats of foreclosure hanging over their heads. The sense of relief was palpable, but I knew that tearing down the oppressive system was only half the battle. The real challenge was ensuring that another power-hungry individual did not try to take Richard's place. I had already acquired a majority of the properties in the neighborhood as part of my takeover strategy, which meant I had a rare opportunity to reshape the future of the community. Instead of reinstating the HOA under new leadership, I proposed something radical: getting rid of the homeowners association entirely and returning full property rights to the residents. Many people were hesitant at first. They had lived under HOA rule for so long that they had grown accustomed to the idea that a governing body was necessary to maintain order. But I made my case clear: the HOA had done nothing but cause misery, and homeowners were fully capable of making their own decisions about their properties without a corrupt board dictating their every move. I outlined a plan that would replace the HOA's rigid enforcement with a voluntary neighborhood council. This council would be made up of residents who actually lived in the community, and its only purpose would be to organize community events, handle shared expenses like street maintenance, and provide a space for open discussions about neighborhood concerns. Unlike an HOA, it would have no power to impose fines, no authority to foreclose on homes, and no ability to force people into unwanted changes. homeowners would finally have full control over their properties without interference. The response was overwhelmingly positive. Once people realized they would no longer be forced to abide by absurd rules or pay unnecessary fees, they quickly embraced the idea. We held a vote, and in a landslide decision, the community officially abolished the HOA forever. The restrictive rulebooks, the endless fines, and the dictatorial board meetings became a thing of the past. With the neighborhood finally free, I focused on undoing the damage Richard had caused. I used the funds recovered from the lawsuit to help homeowners who had been unfairly fined or forced to make costly modifications to their homes. We restored properties that had fallen into disrepair due to the previous regime's harassment, and we established a community fund to support residents who needed financial assistance with essential home maintenance. The atmosphere of the neighborhood transformed overnight. Without the constant fear of being penalized for minor infractions, homeowners started taking more pride in their properties. Families who had once lived in fear of Richard's bullying now gathered for community events without worry. Neighbors who had been divided by HOA conflicts came together, rebuilding friendships that had been strained for years. The sense of unity that had been crushed under Richard's rule was now stronger than ever. As for me, I finally completed construction on my dream home, the very home Richard had tried so desperately to keep me from building. Every time I looked out over my land, I felt an overwhelming sense of satisfaction, not just because I had won, but because I had turned a personal battle into something much greater. This neighborhood was no longer a place of oppression, it was now a place of true community and freedom. And the best part? Richard Calloway was gone for good, and no one like him would ever hold power over this neighborhood again.